The first time I saw him, I told myself it was nothing. Just admiration, nothing more. Mike stood at the front of the classroom, his presence commanding yet effortless. He looked sharp, his tweed blazer fitting his lean frame perfectly, a picture of quiet confidence. His voice was deep, measured, deliberate. The kind of voice that makes you lean in, that makes you want to hear more. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Other women in the class stole glances, but I wasn't interested in some foolish crush. I was just here for my course, something to fill the empty hours when my husband was away. Or at least, that's what I told myself. At first, it was innocent. A simple question after class. Then another. Then coffee, because I needed help understanding something in the syllabus. Mike was brilliant, of course. But more than that, he was present. He listened. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. Tony, my husband, was always moving: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Venezuela. The oil and gas industry had taken him everywhere. We had the big house, the prestigious schools for our son, the exotic vacations. But I had learned something money couldn't fix: loneliness. At night, I stretched out my hand in bed, and there was nothing there. I crushed the duvet against me, but it only made the emptiness worse. So, I leaned into Mike's attention. A little too much. It wasn't long before we were spending more time together outside of class. Tennis at the club, coffee in between meetings, long conversations about books, ideas, life. It felt natural, safe. But underneath it all, I knew what was happening. I was drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. Or maybe I could, but I didn't want to. Then one evening, after a long game of tennis, he smiled at me in that slow, knowing way. "You know you can call me anytime if you need help with your work." His voice was smooth, warm, inviting. I made the most of it. When he invited me to the seminar out of town, I didn't hesitate. "It'll be useful for your course," he had said, but we both knew that wasn't the real reason. The seminar came and went. It hardly mattered. What mattered was the way he looked at me over dinner afterward, the way my skin burned under his gaze. Back at his place, I felt it shift: the air, the energy, the weight of everything unsaid. He poured us drinks, and I walked over, my heart pounding. I reached for his tie, just slightly, just enough. "Tell me to leave," I whispered, but I didn't move away. His breath hitched. His hands brushed my waist, my skin electric beneath his touch. But then he pulled back. Something in his eyes, regret, maybe, made my stomach twist. "I can't," he said softly. A sharp sting of rejection settled in my chest. I turned away, swallowing hard. "I should go," I murmured. And just like that, the moment was gone. But I knew this wasn't over. The drive back home was quiet. Mike didn't bring up what had happened or almost happened. I didn't either. But the silence between us was different now, heavy with unspoken words. That night, I lay in bed, my body restless, my mind tangled in thoughts. Tony had called earlier, his voice distant, tired. "How was your weekend?" he had asked, like he always did. And like I always did, I told him fine. But it wasn't fine. Because I had almost crossed a line. And I hated that he stopped me. I told myself I'd put distance between us. I told myself I'd be professional, mature. But the next time I saw Mike in class, something inside me ached. His eyes found mine, just for a second. But in that second, everything that had happened or almost happened rushed back like a flood. I avoided him after class. Or at least, I tried. But that evening, my phone lit up. "Mike, can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. I knew what the right answer was. I knew what I should do. I typed, "Yes." We met at a small cafe, one of those quiet places where people whispered over wine and coffee. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Dee, I need to know something." "What?" I asked, voice steady. If I hadn't stopped, what would have happened? I swallowed. The answer was too easy. "You know." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "That's what scares me," he admitted. "I wanted you, Dee. I still do. My breath caught. His words felt like heat spreading across my skin. But it wouldn't just be one night, would it? He continued, voice low. It would be more. A lump formed in my throat. Because he was right. This wasn't just a mistake waiting to happen. This was something deeper. Something dangerous. I should have walked away that night. Instead, I let him drive me home. Instead, I let him walk me to my door. Instead, I turned to him when I should have gone inside. His eyes flickered down to my lips, just for a second. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I wanted him to kiss me, and I think, for a moment, he almost did. But then, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he took a slow step back. Good night, Dee. His voice was rough. I nodded, barely breathing, and slipped inside before I could say something I'd regret. I closed the door, and slid down against it, pressing a hand to my chest, trying to steady the storm inside me. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. It started with a simple excuse. I needed help with an assignment, something about research methodology. I could have emailed him, could have waited until the next class, but I didn't. I showed up at his office after hours. He looked surprised to see me, but he didn't turn me away. Come in. His voice was quiet, controlled. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. That was the moment. The moment when we both knew this was going to happen. We talked about my project. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was watching his mouth. The way he leaned back against the desk, arms crossed, sleeves pushed up, his forearms strong and tensed. I was remembering how his voice had sounded that night at the cafe. I still want you. And I was thinking about how much I wanted him, too. He must have seen it in my eyes. Because he stopped mid-sentence. Silence stretched between us. I should have looked away. I should have left. But I didn't. Neither did he. Dee, his voice was strained, like he was fighting something inside him. I took a slow step forward. Tell me to leave, I whispered. And I will. He didn't. Instead, his hand lifted, hesitant at first, then bolder, his fingers trailing up my arm, setting fire to my skin. And that was it. One moment, we were staring at each other, our breath uneven. The next, his lips crashed against mine. I gasped into his mouth as he pulled me closer, his hands sliding around my waist, urgent, desperate. I pressed into him, drinking in the heat of his body, my fingers tangling in his hair. The desk behind him shifted under our weight as he pulled me even closer, his mouth trailing fire along my neck, my jaw. We shouldn't, I breathed against his lips. I know. His voice was hoarse. But I don't care. Neither did I.
Everything blurred, his hands roaming my back, my nails digging into his shoulders, the sharp inhale of breath when my lips found the pulse at his throat. There was no logic now, no reason. Only need. The air crackled between us, thick with unspoken desires. His hesitant touch only fueled the fire that had been smoldering for so long. My own impatience mirrored his, a frantic yearning that demanded release. The delicate fabric of my blouse gave way with a soft rip, a sound swallowed by the tempest raging in my ears. His gaze locked on mine, a silent question passing between us, a question already answered 1,000 times in the stolen glances and lingering touches we'd shared. There was no turning back now. The precipice was behind us, and we were falling, willingly, into the consuming inferno of our shared need. His hands moved again to my waist, fingers fumbling, as though afraid of the moment breaking. But nothing was breaking. Not this time. We were too far gone.
I had imagined this moment more times than I could count. Lying in my lonely bed at night, the cold sheets swallowing me, I had pictured his hands on me, his voice whispering my name. I had thought about the way his mouth might feel, firm, insistent, but tender in ways I wouldn't expect. Now, it was real. And it was even more intoxicating than I had dared to dream. His hands were sure, guiding me back against the desk, pressing his weight against me. I gasped, my body arching instinctively, desperate for the friction, the heat, the solidness of him. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing uneven. "Dee," he whispered, voice rough with restraint. I lifted my gaze to his, my hands sliding up his chest, feeling the fast thud of his heart beneath my palms. "Please," I murmured. "Don't stop." He exhaled sharply, like a man who had lost his last reason to fight. And then he kissed me again, deeper this time, with none of the hesitation from before. My body responded instinctively, molding into him as his hands roamed over me, claiming, exploring, learning the shape of me. His blazer hit the floor. Buttons loosened. My blouse slipped from my shoulders, his fingertips grazing my bare skin, setting it ablaze. There was no stopping now. The rational part of me, the one that whispered about my marriage, about the consequences, about how wrong this was, had long since drowned under the weight of longing. Nothing had ever felt more right. I let my hands roam over his body, relishing the way he shivered under my touch. We moved together in a fevered haze, lips seeking, hands grasping, bodies pressing closer, closer. A moan slipped from my lips as he lifted me onto the desk, his mouth trailing heat along my collarbone, lower, lower. I gasped. I had imagined this moment. But I had never imagined how completely he would consume me, or how much I would crave it. The storm had passed. I lay there, still catching my breath, my head resting against his chest. His fingers traced lazy circles along my spine, his breath warm against my hair. The office was a mess, papers scattered, my blouse half-draped over the chair, his tie dangling from the desk. Reality was creeping back in, slow but inevitable. I should feel guilty. I should regret this. But as his arms tightened around me, as I listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, I knew one thing with startling clarity. I didn't. Because I had decided to do something for myself, just for once. I was happy, really happy. I thanked him for a wonderful evening. I had left home that evening as a deserted but devoted wife, but when I returned later that night, devoted had gone.